Before Glacier Bay was a bay, it was a homeland. Where cruise ships now move through deep salt water, Huna Tlingit oral history remembers something completely different. A broad plain crossed by rivers, surrounded by mountains, with clan houses, fishing camps, berry grounds, and families who had lived there for generations. Then, the glacier began to move. It advanced across the valley, crushed the villages, buried belongings left behind, and forced the clans toward open water. According to one of the most important versions of the story, a young woman named Kaasteen remained as the ice closed over the place her people had called home. For centuries, the Huna Tlingit carried the memory of that lost landscape. Modern geology arrived much later, and when scientists reconstructed what Glacier Bay looked like before the 18th century, they found something remarkable. The bay had once been a wide glacial plain. People could have lived along its rivers exactly where the oral tradition placed them. Then, after remaining relatively stable for generations, the ice surged forward with extraordinary speed and overran the land. The old account and the geological record do not agree on every meaning, but they describe the same vanished landscape. So what was buried beneath Glacier Bay? And after the ice retreated, was anything from that lost homeland left behind? Today, Glacier Bay stretches roughly 65 miles into the mountains of southeastern Alaska. Its waterways pass between forested islands, steep rock walls, and glaciers descending from the Fairweather Range. It is easy to look at that landscape and assume it has always existed in roughly the same form. It has not. In 1794, when a British survey commanded by George Vancouver reached the area, there was no long open bay to navigate. Ice occupied almost the entire space. The entrance appeared as little more than an indentation in the coastline, blocked by a glacier extending toward Icy Strait. That wall of ice was reportedly more than 4,000 feet thick in places, up to 20 miles wide, and connected to an enormous glacial system reaching far into the mountains. Less than a century later, when John Muir visited in 1879, the glacier had retreated approximately 48 miles. By 1916, the ice front had withdrawn roughly 65 miles from the mouth of the bay. It was one of the fastest glacial retreats documented in historical time. But George Vancouver was not discovering an empty wilderness. The Huna Tlingit already knew the place. They knew what had existed before the glacier reached the sea, because their history began on the other side of the ice. The ancestral landscape was known as S'e Shuyee, a name translated by the National Park Service as the edge or end of the glacial silt. It was not the deep marine channel visitors see today. Both Tlingit oral tradition and geological research describe a broad, outwash plain. A distant glacier stood at the head of the valley, while rivers crossed the flatter land below it. For hundreds of years, Huna clans established villages and seasonal camps along those waterways. Families harvested salmon, hunted harbor seals, gathered berries, collected plants, processed hides, and used the timber growing around their homes. The glacier was part of their world, but it was not yet occupying their villages. It remained far enough away for life to continue. 4 principal Huna Tlingit clans held territories in and around Glacier Bay. Their relationship with the place was not simply one of residence. The land contained clan histories, names, songs, crests, harvesting grounds, and relationships with ancestors. That distinction matters. Calling Glacier Bay an unoccupied wilderness erases the very people whose traditions preserved its earlier geography. The Huna Tlingit did not remember a blank plain waiting to become a national park. They remembered home. Before we continue, if you are drawn to stories in which ancestral memory and physical evidence begin describing the same lost place, consider subscribing. That is what this channel investigates, not by forcing an answer, but by following each account as far as the surviving evidence allows. The most powerful Huna account of the glacial advance centers on a Chookaneidí Clan woman remembered as Kaasteen. There are several versions, and that should be stated clearly. In some, Kaasteen is a young girl. In others, her grandmother takes her place. Some traditions say they remain together. Those differences are not meaningless, but neither do they erase the event at the center of every version. A settled homeland was overtaken by advancing ice. The people escaped. Someone stayed behind. According to versions recorded from Huna Tlingit elders, Kaasteen lived in one of the villages on the Outwash Plain during the middle of the 18th century. At the time of her first menstruation, she was placed in seclusion according to the customs described in the account. The glacier had remained distant for generations. It was visible, powerful, and spiritually alive, but it had not yet crossed the broad valley toward the settlements. Then Kaasteen called to it. In the recorded telling, the young woman repeatedly summoned the distant ice. The glacier answered. It began to rumble and move toward the villages. Taken literally, the story describes a human voice calling a glacier across a valley. Modern geology does not explain glacial movement that way. A glacier advances when the balance between snow accumulation, ice flow, temperature, precipitation, and melting changes. During the period known as the Little Ice Age, cooler conditions allowed glaciers in many regions to expand. But reducing the Kaasteen account to a mistaken scientific explanation would miss what the tradition is doing. Within Huna Tlingit understanding, human conduct and the natural world are not entirely separate. A moment of disrespect can disturb a relationship that depends on balance. The glacier is not treated as dead scenery. It hears, it responds, it remembers. The account therefore preserves both an environmental event and a warning. Powerful places must not be approached carelessly. When the people realized the glacier was approaching, they began loading their canoes. There would have been no road leading away from the valley, no vehicles, no outside authority arriving to coordinate an evacuation. Families had to decide what could be carried, what must be abandoned, and how quickly they could reach open water before the ice cut off their escape. Clan houses were not small temporary shelters. Traditional Tlingit winter houses were substantial wooden structures built for extended families. Heavy interior posts supported large horizontal beams. Thick finished planks formed floors and walls, and daily life took place around a central hearth. A village represented years of labor and generations of ownership. Those buildings could not simply be placed in canoes and moved. The fleeing clans carried what they could, but according to the story, they also understood that someone had to remain to appease the glacier's spirit. In many versions, Kaasteen stayed. In others, her grandmother remained instead, choosing to surrender her own life so the younger woman could escape. Another telling remembers the two of them staying together. The families did not abandon the person carelessly. They brought preserved food, skins, warm robes, and valuable belongings. The objects were placed with the woman who would remain as the glacier approached. Then the canoes departed. 2 mourning songs were composed as the families moved away from their homeland. There is no need to make this moment more dramatic than it already is. A community was watching its entire landscape disappear. Behind them stood their houses, stored food, tools, fishing sites, familiar rivers, and the graves and spirits of those who had come before. Somewhere on that plain remained a woman surrounded by the things her people had gathered for her. Then the ice reached the village. The homes were crushed. The ground vanished beneath the glacier, and Kaasteen became part of the frozen landscape. For the Chookaneidí Clan, this was not merely the loss of one person. Her sacrifice established an enduring relationship between the clan and Glacier Bay. Ice and glaciers became connected with her memory and with the price paid for the clan's survival. The Huna clans moved south and dispersed through Icy Strait, Excursion Inlet, and northern Chichagof Island. Eventually, many settled at S'e Shuyee, translated as a shelter from the north wind, the community now known as Huna. The places outside Glacier Bay allowed the clans to survive, but the oral histories describe the lost homeland as richer and more abundant. They had escaped the glacier. They had not stopped belonging to the land beneath it. For a long time, Western histories treated the story as culture rather than evidence. Geologists studied moraines, sediment layers, buried wood, old shorelines, and the movement of ice. Ethnographers recorded place names, songs, and oral accounts. These sources often occupied separate worlds. Then researchers began comparing them more carefully. A 2009 scientific study reconstructed the changing landscape of the Huna Tlingit homeland using glacial geology, landforms, ethnographic descriptions, and more than 50 radiocarbon dates, including 38 previously compiled dates and 15 newly dated samples. The results did not reveal an imaginary valley. They revealed a landscape strikingly similar to the one preserved in Huna memory. The lower bay had not always been filled with deep water. Over time, glacial sediments built an extensive outwash plain across the area. By at least 1,600 years ago, that plain was developing. Roughly 500 years ago, it had expanded through much of lower Glacier Bay. The environment would not have been easy. It was shaped by moving rivers, sediment, nearby ice, and changing shorelines. But the scientific reconstruction concluded that the conditions were difficult yet habitable. This matters because the oral tradition does not place the villages in an impossible environment. It places them beside rivers on a broad valley floor, with a glacier standing at a distance. That is also what the geology describes. The next part of the scientific reconstruction is even more important. For a prolonged period, the central portion of the plain remained in place. Then, sometime between 1724 and 1794, the ice overrode it. The final advance was abrupt. The researchers used a blunt word for what happened to the people living there. They were evicted from their homeland by the glacier. The scientific chronology does not identify Kaasteen. It does not confirm that a human voice summoned the ice or that a sacrifice stopped it. But it confirms the basic historical sequence. A habitable plain existed. Huna Tlingit communities occupied the region. The ice remained distant. Then it advanced rapidly enough to force the population out. That correspondence is not a minor resemblance. It involves the shape of the landscape, the position of the glacier, the presence of settlements, and the timing of a sudden displacement. The oral account preserved those elements without maps, aerial photographs, radiocarbon laboratories, or written measurements. It remembered a place that no longer existed when later outsiders arrived. And that, honestly, is where this case becomes difficult to dismiss. The story did not merely say that a glacier once covered the region. Anyone looking at the surrounding ice might have imagined that. It remembered what came before the ice. A broad land of rivers and settlements where the bay now reaches deep into the mountains. Modern research reconstructed that buried geography centuries later. Still, caution matters. Oral traditions change as they pass between generations. Details may be emphasized differently by different clans or storytellers. The versions recorded in the 20th century cannot be assumed to reproduce every word spoken in the 18th. Geological evidence also cannot verify the spiritual meaning of the story. Science can reconstruct ice movement. It cannot determine whether Kaasteen called the glacier, whether her grandmother remained in her place, or how the Huna Tlingit should understand the sacrifice. Those belong to the community that preserved the account. The purpose of comparison should not be to take a sacred history away from its people and convert it into a scientific curiosity. The purpose is to recognize that the history contains real geographic memory. The glacier did advance, the homeland was overrun, the people fled, and their descendants remembered where the lost landscape had been. When the ice began retreating, the Huna Tlingit returned. According to the National Park Service account, this happened within approximately 50 years. But the land they entered was no longer S'e Shuyee. The broad plain, rivers, camps, and villages had been scraped, flooded, or buried. Salt water moved into the immense valley carved and deepened by the ice. The returning clans gave the transformed landscape another name, S'e Shuyee, the bay in place of the glacier. The name itself is a historical record. It describes a sequence. First there was inhabited land, then there was ice. Afterward, there was a bay. The people re-established fishing camps and several villages as the glacier continued to withdraw. They returned to harvest, travel, teach, and maintain relationships with the places associated with their clans. Yet returning to Glacier Bay did not mean the earlier homeland had reappeared. The ice had transformed it too completely. A modern visitor sees islands, fjords, beaches, forests, and open water. The Huna Tlingit also see what is absent. They carry the memory of land beneath the bay. So what physically could remain? That question has no dramatic answer yet. No intact village has been confirmed beneath the floor of Glacier Bay. No preserved clan house has been raised from the sediment, and no archaeological discovery proves that Kaasteen's belongings remain together where the tradition places them. A glacier does not preserve everything gently. It crushes, drags, buries, scatters, and grinds. It can remove soil, tear out trees, redirect rivers, and carry enormous quantities of rock. When the ice retreats, meltwater deposits additional sediment. Later, seawater covers the lower ground and adds marine material above it. Anything left from the earlier settlements may have been destroyed, moved far from its original position, or buried beneath layers of till, outwash, and seafloor sediment. The title of this story should not be mistaken for a promise that an intact frozen village is waiting to be uncovered. That has not been demonstrated. Today, Glacier Bay appears open, immense, and almost empty. But emptiness depends on what a person has been taught to see. Beneath the water lies a former valley. Beneath the sediment lies the geological evidence of a glacial advance. Within Huna Tlingit history lies the memory of the families who lived there before either existed in its modern form. Science can tell us when the glacier moved and how the plain was overrun. It cannot replace the voice of the people who watched their homeland disappear. The Huna Tlingit account preserved something no later map could recover on its own. It preserved what was there before the bay. Do you think the Glacier Bay story should be understood as a direct historical memory of the 18th century glacial advance, or as something larger, a spiritual account carrying real history inside it? And has your own family ever preserved the memory of a home or landscape that no longer exists? Share that story in the comments. If you return for investigations where ancestral memory, forgotten landscapes, and physical evidence meet, subscribe. Because across America, some of the places described as empty are only empty on the newest maps.